The morning they sold her, the sky was the wrong color. Not the deep bruised purple of a storm coming in, not the soft gray of an ordinary overcast dawn. It was amber. A thick, burning amber that pressed down over the territory of Aldenmore like a held breath. Like the world itself knew something had broken and didn't yet know how to respond. Bonnie noticed it through the gap in the wooden walls of the holding pen. A holding pen. As if she were livestock. As if the woman who had danced at every moon ceremony, every harvest, every birth and bonding in this pack for 6 years was now something to be contained and counted. She kept her eyes on the sky. The crowd outside the pen was quiet in a way that felt worse than noise. Aldenmore's wolves had gathered in numbers along the main road, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Children peered between adult legs. Elders stood with their arms folded and their eyes down. No one was celebrating. No one was cheering their alpha's decision. And yet not one of them had stepped forward. Not one voice had risen in the night to say this is wrong. The silence was its own kind of wound, one that went deeper than anything Gad's claws had done. Bonnie touched the back of her neck. The skin there was raw, still tender where his alpha claws had dragged through the hair she had carried since birth. The heavy, dark waves that had always fallen to her waist and moved when she danced like something alive. It was gone now. Sheared off in fistfuls in front of the entire court, dropped to the stone floor of the great hall like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. The women in the court had gone so still you could hear the pieces fall. Gad had called it a distraction. He'd said it with his chest out and his jaw set. The way he said everything he wanted to believe made him look powerful. Your hair distracts the pack. Your dancing distracts the pack. You have taken eyes that should be on their alpha and turned them on yourself, and I will not allow it. What he hadn't said, what she had watched living behind his eyes for months, was the truth. That the merchants who came through Aldenmore always asked for her by name. That visiting dignitaries requested seats nearest the dance floor when they heard she would perform. That his own wolves, after a long season's work, gathered not around their alpha's fire but around the clearing, where Bonnie danced her prism dance, and left those evenings with their shoulders lower, their laughter easier, their children sleeping through the night without nightmares for the first time in weeks. He had not been able to stand it. A man like Gad could not stand being loved less than his own mate in his own territory. And so he had destroyed what he couldn't control. And then, because destruction alone hadn't satisfied whatever hollow, rotting thing lived inside him, he had sold her. She heard the horses before she saw them. A procession unlike anything Aldenmore's road had witnessed. Black stallions, 8 of them. Their coats so dark they seemed to absorb the amber light rather than reflect it. The carriage behind them was iron and dark wood, bearing no crest, no color, no softness of any kind. It did not need decoration. Everyone in every territory between here and the Deadlands knew what it meant when the rogue Alpha King sent his procession. It meant someone was being taken somewhere they would not return from. The whispers started immediately, low and afraid, threading through the crowd like smoke. Bonnie heard her name pass between them. She heard the word, Deadlands. She heard a child ask its mother why the pretty dancer was in the cage, and heard the mother go silent. The carriage stopped. A man descended first, not the king, but clearly his, tall, dressed in dark leather, with the kind of face that had long since stopped registering other people's fear as remarkable. He carried a sealed document. He handed it to Gad second without looking at him. Gad stood on the steps of the great hall. He had dressed for this. Ceremonial furs, on his alpha chain across his chest, his expression arranged into something that was trying very hard to look like authority, and landing somewhere closer to relief. He had sold her, and he was relieved. 6 years of her cooking in his kitchen, dancing in his court, sleeping in his bed, giving his pack something they had thrived on without ever understanding why. And what lived on his face this morning was relief. Bonnie finally looked away from him. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had decided that in the night, when the tears had come and she'd let them come privately, quietly, and then she'd pressed her palms flat against the floor and breathed until the shaking stopped. She had decided, whatever happened next, whatever the Deadlands meant, whatever the rogue Alpha King was in truth or in legend, she would walk out of this pen on her own feet. The crowd parted before the guard who led her. She felt their eyes like rainfall, everywhere at once, impossible to name individually, impossible to ignore. She heard Mara, the baker's wife who always saved her sweet rolls from the second bake, make a sound low in her throat that she quickly swallowed. She heard old Fenwick, who had watched her dance more times than he could count and always wept a little at the prism sequence, say something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. She did not look for Gad. She stepped up into the carriage. The door closed behind her, and the iron was cold, and the amber sky pressed down, and the horses began to move, and Aldenmore fell away behind her through the narrow window. And Bonnie pressed 2 fingers against the raw skin at the back of her neck and held herself very, very still. She did not know what she was going to the Deadlands to face. She had heard the stories. Every wolf in every territory had heard the stories. Alpha King Magnus, rogue by choice, not by banishment, which was somehow the more terrifying thing, who had carved his kingdom out of the most forsaken land on the continent, who accepted challenges and ended them swiftly and completely, who had never taken a queen despite a dozen attempts by powerful families to place their daughters in his path. The Deadlands, they said, were dying. Feral rot had taken root there, turning wolves mindless and frothing and dangerous, and Gad had sent her there believing she would die slowly among the mad wolves and the dry earth and the king who had no softness in him. What Gad did not know, what no one in Aldenmore had ever thought to wonder, was why they had been so safe. Drought had swept the region. Every pack Bonnie had heard word of was struggling. Crops failing, rivers dropping, the ground turning hard and ungenerous. And feral rot, that new and terrible madness that stripped wolves of reason and left them howling at nothing, had torn through territories like fire through dry grass. Whole packs had fractured. Alphas had lost half their numbers to the rot. It was all anyone spoke of when traders came through. But not Aldenmore. Aldenmore's granaries were full. Aldenmore's river ran clear. Aldenmore's wolves were sane and whole, and their children played without fear in the open fields. No one had asked why. It was the kind of blessing that people accepted gratefully and incuriously, the way they accepted good weather, as luck, as favor, as something they probably deserved. But it had not been luck. Every time Bonnie had taken the dance floor, at moon ceremonies, at harvests, at the simple evenings when wolves gathered just to watch because watching her made something inside them settle, her hair had moved with her. Those long, heavy, dark waves, catching the firelight, or the moonlight, or the afternoon sun, lifting and falling and spinning with each movement of her body, had been doing something that neither she nor anyone else had ever had language for. The women of her bloodline had always danced, and they had always had extraordinary hair. No one in her family had ever explained it as power, because it had never felt separate from them. It was simply what they were. Simply what they did. The dance was a ritual. The hair was its instrument. And every time Bonnie had performed her prism dance in Aldenmore's heart, those dark waves had stitched the pack's borders invisible seam by invisible seam, weaving something into the boundary of the territory that kept the rot out, that called water to the ground, that pressed warmth and sanity into the soil. She had been their protection, and she had not known it. And now she was in an iron carriage moving toward the Deadlands, and her hair was gone, and Aldenmore was behind her. The silence inside the carriage was absolute. It was the kind of silence that had no interest in being filled, that pressed against the ears and settled into the chest. Bonnie sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and her eyes on the narrow strip of landscape visible through the window, and she breathed the way her mother had taught her, slowly, from the belly, the way dancers breathed when the emotion in a performance threatened to overtake the body doing the performing. The carriage rolled on. The trees changed. The amber light thinned. And in the silence, without permission, the memory came. She had been 19 when Gad first saw her dance. It had not been a formal performance. No ceremonial floor, no arranged audience, just a midsummer gathering at the border market, where packs from 3 territories traded grain and livestock and news. Bonnie's people had come to sell woven cloth and dried herbs, and someone had brought drums, and someone else had cleared a space. And Bonnie had danced because the drums asked her to, and her body never knew how to refuse a drum. She hadn't known anyone was watching beyond the usual warm circle of familiar faces. She had done the prism sequence, the one her grandmother had taught her, the one that required her hair to be loose so it could move with the turns, catching light and throwing it in fragments the way water through sunlight. She had felt the familiar deep settle of it, the feeling she'd never found words for, that something in her was doing more than moving, that the dance was both expression and something else she couldn't name. The drums and her body and her hair and the warm midsummer air had become one continuous thing. When she stopped, she heard silence first, then a sound that wasn't applause exactly, more like a collective exhale, like every person watching had been holding their breath and only now remembered how to release it. Then she saw him. He was standing at the edge of the cleared space, slightly apart from his men, and he was looking at her the way people sometimes looked at something they hadn't expected to encounter and weren't sure yet what to do about it. He was handsome in the obvious way of men who had always been told so. Strong jaw, broad through the shoulder, dark eyes that held a warmth then that she would later understand had always been conditional. But in that moment, he was simply a man looking at her like she had done something to him that he hadn't asked for and couldn't undo. He had come to find her afterward, hat in hand, quite literally, turning it between his fingers in a way that suggested Alpha Gad of Aldenmore was not accustomed to being nervous. "I've never seen anyone dance like that," he'd said. "You probably haven't," she'd replied, not unkindly. "It's specific to my bloodline." That had made him smile, a real one. She remembered being surprised by it, how much younger it made him look. The courtship had lasted 4 months. He had come to every gathering where she performed, increasingly less subtle about the fact that he was there for her specifically. He had sent gifts, good ones, chosen with attention rather than wealth, which she had appreciated. He had sat with her pack elders with genuine respect. He had asked about her people, about the bloodline, about why the women of her line all had such extraordinary hair, and she had told him honestly, "We don't entirely know. It's always been ours. We've always danced. The two things together are something our grandmothers called a gift," but they never explained further than that. He had listened. She had believed then that he was the kind of man who listened. Before she had agreed to anything, she had told him the truth that she knew would cost her. She had sat across from him in her mother's home, with her hands folded, and said it plainly, the way her mother had always said difficult things were best said. "My bloodline only births daughters. Not one woman in our line has ever carried a son. If you take me as your mate, Alpha Gad, you will never have a male heir. I need you to understand that before anything else." She had watched him absorb it, had watched the calculation that moved across his face, and then, to his credit then, had watched him set it aside. "I don't want an heir," he had said. "I want you. If I can't have you, I'll have no one." She had believed him. She had left her people and come to Aldenmore as his mate, a foreigner in his territory, and it had been harder than she'd expected. The way foreign always was, the way belonging had to be built rather than assumed. But she had built it. With her hands and her voice and her dancing, and the simple consistency of showing up, of learning Aldenmore's customs and honoring them while not erasing her own, of cooking for the pack on feast days until the great hall smelled like her mother's kitchen, of performing the prism dance at the first moon ceremony they invited her to, and watching Aldenmore's wolves leave that evening quieter and more settled and somehow fuller than they had arrived. They had loved her. Not immediately, but truly. The kind of love that builds in layers, that has texture and history and weight. And Gad had loved her too. She believed that now, even as the carriage carried her toward the Deadlands, he had loved her the way some men loved things that made them feel extraordinary by proximity. And the trouble with that kind of love was what happened when the thing you loved began to outshine you rather than reflect you. It had changed slowly. So slowly she had almost missed it. The first time he'd left the dance floor before she finished. The first time a visiting merchant had asked for her by name, and she'd watched Gad's jaw tighten. The first time he had come to bed in silence and turned his back, and she had lain awake beside him, trying to identify what she had done, not yet understanding that what she had done was exist too fully, too brightly, too much. His jealousy had grown in him the way rot grew in wood, invisible until the structure was already compromised. She had tried to talk to him. She had offered to perform less publicly, to keep the prism dance for pack ceremonies only. He had waved her off, called her foolish, said she was inventing problems. And then one morning, he had stood before the court, with his alpha claws extended, and he had listed her failings in front of every wolf in Aldenmore. The distraction of her dancing, the embarrassment of her barrenness, the insult, he'd called it, of a mate who drew more eyes than her own alpha. And then he had reached for her hair. Bonnie pressed her fingers against the back of her neck, in the silence of the iron carriage, and watched the trees outside grow bone-white and bare as Aldenmore's familiar pines gave way to something older and more skeletal, stripped of leaves in the wrong season. She did not let herself think about what she had lost. She thought instead about what she still had, the knowledge of her own name, the memory of her mother's hands, the discipline of a body trained since childhood to move through pain without stopping. She would not stop. The Deadlands pressed their gray silence against the carriage window. The sky above was flat and toneless, sound pressed out of it entirely. But as the carriage rolled through what must have been a border settlement, she saw stone buildings, low and practical, smoke curling from chimneys, a man mending a wall who paused to watch the procession pass without fear in his face, a woman hanging cloth who looked up with simple curiosity, children moving between buildings with purpose. These were not the mad, frothing wolves she had imagined. These were people living in a hard place. But living. The carriage stopped before the castle. Gray stone, dense and permanent, rising 4 stories with towers at each corner, torches burning in iron brackets that bent no pretense toward decoration. Bonnie stepped out of the carriage. She felt him before she saw him, a presence, a weight in the air, something that made her wolf stir for the first time in weeks despite everything. The Alpha King Magnus of the Deadlands stood at the top of the castle steps. Not monstrous, as the stories had built him. Not barely human. A man. Tall, broad through the shoulder, dark hair cut close, a beard grown past intention. Gray eyes that caught the torchlight and did nothing to soften it. A scar running jaw to collarbone on the left side, clean and old. He looked at her. Not at the raw skin at her nape. Not at the ruin of what remained of her hair. At her face. The way very few people had ever looked at her. Not looking for the dancer, not looking for what she could give him. Just looking. Bonnie squared her shoulders and held his gaze and did not look away. He descended the steps and stopped 2 feet from her, and the torchlight moved between them. And then he spoke. Low. Not a performance. Just a voice. You're not what I expected, he said. Bonnie held his gaze. Neither are you. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise. Something more careful than either. He turned and climbed the steps, and over his shoulder. Come inside. You must be cold. Bonnie stood at the foot of those steps, the amber of Aldenmore long faded, the gray sky pressing down, her neck still raw, her heart broken in the specific and irreparable way only a mate's betrayal could break something. And far behind her, in the territory of Aldenmore, where the granaries had always been full, and the river had always run clear, and the wolves had always woken sane. The first wolf went mad at midnight. The first wolf who went mad was a child. That was the detail that would haunt Aldenmore for years afterward. Not the violence of it, not the sound, but the specific cruelty of the timing. A boy of 9, the blacksmith's son, who had gone to sleep ordinary and woken in the deep of midnight, making sounds no child's throat should be capable of making. His parents had found him in the corner of his room, with his hands pressed flat against the wall, and his eyes gone the color of curdled milk. And when his father had touched his shoulder, the boy had turned, and there had been nothing behind his face. Nothing recognizable. Nothing left. By morning, there were 3 more. By the end of the second day, there were 11, and the pack healers were using words like feral rot in low, careful voices that tried and failed to contain what those words actually meant. Gade stood in his great hall and listened to his second deliver the count, and felt something cold move through him that he did not yet name. He was practiced at not naming things that threatened his composure. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself the rot had been coming regardless. It had taken half the continent already. Why should Aldenmore be exempt? He told himself this had nothing to do with the morning prior. Nothing to do with the holding pen, the iron carriage, the amber sky. Nothing to do with her. He told himself all of this with the particular determination of a man who already knows he is lying. Bonnie did not know any of this yet. What she knew was the Deadlands at dawn, which was a different thing entirely from the Deadlands at dusk, and not in the way she had expected. At dusk it had been gray and heavy and airless, the kind of landscape that made the chest feel smaller. But dawn here had a quality she hadn't anticipated. The light came in low and direct, cutting horizontally across the bone-white trees, so that even they, stripped and skeletal as they were, threw long, clean shadows across the ground. There was a severity to it that wasn't without beauty. Like a face that had lived through too much to still be pretty, but had arrived at something more interesting than pretty on the other side. She stood at the narrow window of the room they had given her and studied it. The room itself had surprised her. She had expected a cell, bare stone, cold floor, the message delivered through environment that she was a possession acquired, not a person received. Instead, it was spare but considered. A bed with wool blankets thick enough to mean it. A writing table. A fireplace with wood already stacked beside it, already lit. On the table, someone had left a tray. Bread, cold meat, dried fruit, a clay cup of something that steamed faintly. She hadn't touched it. Not from pride, exactly. Or not only from pride. There was a part of her that didn't yet trust kindness from this direction, that read provision as strategy, warmth as the setup for a demand she hadn't yet been told about. She had arrived expecting a cage and found instead a room with a fire, and that confused her more than the cage would have. A knock at the door. Soft, which also surprised her. She said nothing. The knock came again, and then a woman's voice, low and without particular deference. "There's hot water if you want it, and the king asks if you'll join him in the East Hall when you're ready. No urgency. When you're ready." Bonnie turned from the window. No urgency. An odd thing to communicate to a woman who had been sold. She waited long enough that when you're ready would mean something. Then she washed her face in the hot water that appeared outside her door without ceremony, ate 3 pieces of the dried fruit because her body had its own sense and she would not starve herself on principle, and went to find the East Hall. Magnus was already there when she arrived. He was sitting at the far end of a long wooden table, not at its head with the staging of authority, but along its side, the way a person sat when they were actually using a table rather than presiding over one. There were papers in front of him and a cup beside them, and he was reading with the focused quiet of a man who had learned to take stillness where he could find it. He looked up when she entered but did not stand. Did not perform. "You didn't eat," he said. "Some of it," she said. He accepted this without comment and gestured to the bench across from him. She sat. Between them on the table, she noticed a small clay pot with a lid, and beside it a folded cloth. And beside that a bundle of dried herbs she almost recognized but couldn't quite name. "For your neck," Magnus said, without looking up from his papers. "The healer prepared it. Helps raw skin close faster." Bonnie looked at the pot and said nothing. "You don't have to use it," he said, still not looking up. "It's there if you want it." She didn't touch it. Not yet. She looked at him across the table instead. At the scar along his jaw, at the way his hands moved across the papers with a practicality that matched the castle itself. No wasted motion. No performance. The stories about Magnus had been told to frighten. Rogue by choice. King of the dead place. Collector of broken things. She had expected cruelty worn openly, the way weak men wore it to look strong. She did not know yet what he wore or why, but it was not that. "Why did you want me here?" she asked. He set down his papers and looked at her directly. That same quality of attention she had noticed the night before. The kind that didn't look for anything in particular. That was simply present. "I heard about your dancing," he said. "I'd heard about it for years. I wanted to see it." The simplicity of it disarmed her more than any complex answer would have. No politics. No strategy offered up for her inspection. Just, "I heard. I wanted to see." "I won't be dancing," she said. "I know," he said, and he picked his papers back up. That was all. No argument, no negotiation, no quiet threat dressed as disappointment. He simply accepted it and returned to his work. And the East Hall was quiet around them, with the kind of quiet that didn't require filling. And outside, the low dawn light moved across the bone-white trees. Bonnie sat with that for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and picked up the clay pot. The Deadlands were dying. She understood this better in the days that followed. Not all at once. The understanding came in pieces. The way any true understanding of a place came, through accumulated detail, rather than single revelation. The way the pack wolves moved through the settlement with an efficiency that had anxiety underneath it. The way the healers' building was the most trafficked structure in the entire territory. A constant, quiet traffic of people bringing in the afflicted and leaving with the uncertain. The way the word rot moved through conversations and then was carefully set aside. The way people set aside things too heavy to carry continuously. She had not expected to care. She had arrived broken and furious, and had intended to remain closed, to survive this place without investing in it, to keep herself separate from the Deadlands and its king, the way she had kept herself separate from nothing in her entire life, because separation had never been a thing her nature knew how to do. But on the third day she saw them bring in a woman. 2 men carried her between them, her feet dragging. She was perhaps 40, and she had the look of someone who had been strong her whole life and was only now, against her will, being otherwise. Her eyes had that quality Bonnie had heard described, but never seen. The milky, absent quality of the rot taking hold, the self going dim behind them like a candle running out of wax. She was making sounds, low, rhythmic, without language. Her hands moved against the air as if searching for something no longer there. The healers received her with practiced steadiness. They had done this before. Many times. Bonnie stood in the corridor and watched and felt something move in her that she had been pressing down since the carriage. Not the dance. She would not dance. She had decided she would not dance. The dancing was the thing Gad had taken from her, along with her hair and her dignity, and she was not yet ready to offer it back to a world that had shown her what it did with her gifts. But something adjacent to the dance. Something that lived in the same part of her. She went to the healer's building. She told the woman at the door she had some knowledge of herbs and would like to help where she could. The woman looked at her, at the uneven crop of what remained of her hair, at the healing skin at her nape, at her face, and then simply stepped aside to let her in. She was useful. That steadied her in a way that nothing else had. She learned the healers' names. Fren, the older woman who ran the building with a brisk warmth like a fire that had learned to direct itself. Young Davi, who was barely trained and tried to compensate with energy. Old Soret, who spoke rarely but whose hands knew things his words didn't bother to say. She learned their methods, their herb stores, the stages of the rot as they understood it. She contributed what her own bloodline knew about calming plants, about the specific combination of valerian and whitebark that her mother's people had used for mindless fevers, and watched Fren's eyes sharpen with interest. "Where did you learn that?" Fren asked. "My mother," Bonnie said. "Her mother before her." Fren nodded slowly. "Your people had rot before?" "Not rot," Bonnie said. But madness. Different causes. Some of the calming works the same regardless. The wolves in the advanced stages of rot. The ones fully taken. The ones who had lost language and recognition and everything except the animal underneath. Were kept in the lower rooms, padded, away from light and noise because both seemed to agitate them further. Bonnie had been told not to go near them alone. She went near them alone on the 5th day, when Fren was occupied with 3 new cases arrived from the border settlement and the lower rooms were understaffed. She didn't go to treat them. She didn't know yet what to do for them medically. She went because the sounds they made, those low, lost, rhythmic sounds, reminded her of something she couldn't identify, and she followed the feeling the way she had always followed feelings, the way her body had always known things before her mind arrived. She sat outside the door of the lower room and listened. The sounds were not random. There was pattern in them. Broken, fragmented, like a song with most of its notes missing, but pattern nonetheless. As if whatever the rot had consumed had left this one thing behind, some deep instinct that still reached, that still tried to make rhythm out of the chaos it was trapped in. Without thinking, Bonnie began to hum. Nothing formal, nothing performed. Just a low, undecorated sound, matching the rhythm she heard, giving it a shape it seemed to be reaching for. Her hands moved in her lap. Small movements, involuntary, the ghost of gesture. The sounds behind the door changed, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but the jagged edges of them softened slightly, the way a tangled thing softens when something steady is applied to it. The low searching sounds became, fractionally, less searching. Bonnie sat very still and breathed and hummed and did not call it what it was. She did not call it dancing. She did not call it the gift. She did not look at the meaning underneath it because looking directly at it felt like too much. Like standing too close to a fire still deciding if it would burn her. She called it nothing. She simply sat and hummed until Fren found her and gave her a look that was equal parts concern and something that might have been awe, and told her dinner was ready. She went to dinner. She ate. She did not mention what had happened in the corridor. Magnus noticed. She hadn't expected him to be observant in that particular way. She had read him as a man whose attention was fixed outward, on territory and threat, and the management of a kingdom surviving impossible conditions. But he noticed the way she moved through the Deadlands with increasing familiarity. Noticed the healer's building becoming a regular part of her day. Noticed the change in her that even she couldn't fully name. That settling of a nature that had been violently uprooted and was, despite itself, beginning to find ground again. He didn't comment on it directly. That was his way, she was learning. He did not narrate what he observed, did not offer it back to her as conversation. He simply adjusted. Fresh herbs appeared on her table, ones she had mentioned to Fren in passing. The kitchen began producing, without explanation, the specific flatbread from her homeland that she hadn't eaten in 6 years and hadn't asked for. One morning she found beside her door a carved wooden comb, clearly old, clearly quality, left without note or ceremony. She picked it up and held it and felt something crack slightly in the careful structure she had built. She went to find him. He was in the yard behind the castle, doing something entirely unregal, restacking a woodpile that had fallen, apparently having dismissed whoever had been assigned the task, and decided to do it himself. He looked up when she approached, and waited. She held up the comb. "You keep leaving things," she said. "You keep using them," he said, seemed worth continuing. She looked at him. He looked at her. The Deadlands morning was cold and clear, and the white trees stood around the yard's edge like witnesses. "I'm not going to be grateful to you," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I need you to know that." "I know that," he said. "And I'm not going to dance." "You said." "I mean it." "I believe you," he said. And he turned back to the woodpile. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, the comb in her hand, the cold morning air between them, something entirely inconvenient happening in the vicinity of her chest. Then she went back inside. 3 weeks after Bonnie's arrival in the Deadlands, a rider reached Aldenmoor's eastern border with news from 3 neighboring packs. The feral rot had not merely continued its spread, it had accelerated. Territories that had shown only isolated cases a month ago were now reporting numbers that made the word epidemic feel insufficient. The drought had deepened alongside it, rivers dropping to trickles, the ground growing hard and resistant to everything planted in it. The rider who brought the news did not know this was unusual. He did not know that Aldenmoor had, until 3 weeks prior, been the single exception to everything the continent was suffering. He did not know why that had changed. But Gad knew. Gad stood in his great hall, which was beginning to smell different, stale, dimmer, the particular smell of a space that had lost something essential and was only beginning to show it, and listened to the count, and felt the cold thing in him that he had refused to name since the morning of the amber sky settle into something undeniable. 17 wolves in the rot. The river down by a third. 3 harvests failed. His best hunter had turned mad in the night. Gad stood in his great hall and stared at the stone floor, and in the silence between the numbers his second was reading aloud, he heard it for the first time. The sound of her hair falling. Fistful by fistful. Hitting the stone. The sound he had made himself not hear in the moment he'd caused it. That he had covered with the noise of his own authority. He had known, somewhere beneath every lie he'd told himself, that Bonnie was not ordinary. He had known it since the border market, since the prism dance, since every time he had watched his pack leave her performances with an ease about them, that he had been too proud and too blind to investigate. He had known, and he had called it distraction, and he had destroyed it, and sold what remained to a king who ruled over dead ground. And now the ground was dying here too. And now one of his pack wolves, a man he had known since boyhood, a man with a wife and 2 daughters, was in the healer's room making sounds that had no words left in them. Gad pressed both palms flat against the table and breathed. He needed her back. The thought came with the particular shame of the obvious arriving too late. He needed her back, and he did not yet know if back was a direction still available to him. He did not yet know what it would cost. He did not yet know that the woman he had sheared and caged and sold to the Deadlands was, at this precise moment, sitting in the healer's corridor with her hands moving in the ghost of a dance, coaxing something back towards sanity, with nothing but sound, and the ghost of what he had tried to cut away. He did not know that her hair was already growing. And in the Deadlands, in the East Hall, Magnus had paused his papers, and was watching her through the open door, with an expression on his face that he would not have permitted anyone else to see. Something unguarded. Something that sat in the chest rather than the head. Something that had no business being on the face of a rogue Alpha King, but had arrived there regardless, and showed no intention of leaving. He reached up slowly, and touched the scar along his jaw. Then he looked back at his papers. But he did not read them. On the night the 32nd wolf in Aldenmoor went mad, something happened in the Deadlands that the healers would talk about for the rest of their lives. Bonnie had gone to the lower rooms again, alone again, despite friends' standing instruction, and the sounds from behind the door had been worse that evening, more fractured, more desperate, the searching quality in them sharper, as if whatever remained of the wolves inside the rot was tiring of searching and beginning to give up. She had sat outside the door and begun to hum as she had before, and her hands had begun their small movements. And the comb Magnus had left her was in her hair. The hair that was growing now, she could feel the weight of it returning. Slowly, but returning. And without deciding to, she stood. She stood, and her body did what her body had always done when the drums asked, and the feeling was too large for stillness. It was not the prism dance. Not formally. Not with intention or ceremony or the full power of everything her bloodline carried. But it was a dance. Small, contained, in the corridor of a healer's building in the Deadlands, with no audience and no drums, and nothing but the sound of the broken wolves behind the door, and the feeling that had been building in her since the carriage, since the window at dawn, since the woman being carried in with her feet dragging and her hands searching the empty air. She danced. And behind the door, one by one, the sounds changed. Not cured, not healed, but quieted, the way a fever sometimes broke not all at once, but in a single moment where the body seemed to remember itself. The searching fell away. The fractured rhythm settled. The desperate quality dissolved into something that was simply, barely, but unmistakably, rest. Bonnie stood in the corridor with her chest heaving and her eyes burning and her hands still. From behind her, a voice. Bonnie. Magnus, standing at the corridor's end, having come for reasons she'd never know, arriving in time for reasons she'd never fully understand. His face was doing that thing she had learned to watch for, the careful thing, the controlled thing. But underneath it, breaking through it, something she had no defenses against. She looked at him. He looked at her. They're resting, she said. Her voice came out strange. Thin. I heard, he said. The corridor was cold, and the torchlight moved between them and her hair. Still short, still growing, still nothing like what Gad had taken. Caught the light anyway. The way it always did. The way it always would. And in that moment, without warning, without the slow build she had been bracing against, Bonnie began to cry. Not the careful private crying of the holding pen. Not controlled. The other kind. The kind that came from somewhere below decision, below dignity, below everything she had constructed to survive the last weeks. The kind that meant something had been held too long and could not be held any longer. She did not mean to cry in front of Magnus of all people. She did not mean to do it standing in the corridor outside the room of wolves she had just danced back from the edge. She did not mean to let him see it. And Bonnie slid down the wall and sat on the cold stone floor and let it come. She cried for her hair. She cried for the court that had watched and done nothing. She cried for the 9-year-old girl who had first felt the prism dance move through her and had thought it was only joy. She cried for 6 years of believing a man who had always planned, on some level, to make her small. She cried for her mother, who had told her the dance was sacred, and to give it only to those who deserved it. She had given it to Aldenmore. She had given it freely. And Aldenmore had let her be put in a cage. Magnus sat on the floor beside her, and did not speak, and did not leave. When the crying stopped, she felt hollowed out in the specific way that came after something necessary, and the corridor was quiet, and the wolves behind the door were resting, and the Deadlands pressed their cold, clear silence against everything. My hair, she said finally. It holds power. I didn't fully understand it before, but I understand it now. Magnus was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. She turned to look at him. I've known since the second night, he said. I've been watching what happens when you're near the sick ones. I wasn't certain. Now I am. She studied his face. And nothing, he said. It's yours. It does what you allow it to do. She held that, turned it over, found no catch in it. Outside the Deadlands, somewhere on the road between the continent's dying packs and the castle on the forsaken ground, a merchant would carry a story home about a woman in the Deadlands who had quieted the feral wolves with nothing but movement and the growing darkness of her hair. The story would spread the way stories spread, gathering detail and distortion as it traveled. It would reach Aldenmore in 9 days. It would reach Gad in 10. And when it did, he would do what broken and desperate men always did when they had destroyed the thing they needed. He would go to take it back. The hair grew back faster than it had any right to. Bonnie noticed it first in the morning of the 6th month. Standing at the narrow window with the Deadlands dawn cutting low and horizontal across the yard, her fingers moving to the back of her neck, the way they still did, out of habit, out of the grief that lived in habit. But instead of raw skin, she felt length. Not much. A finger's width past the nape, soft and new, the way growth was when it came back after damage, tentative at first, as if checking whether it was still welcome. She stood at the window for a long time with her hand at her neck and said nothing to no one, and felt something shift in her chest that she wasn't ready to name. By the 7th month, it fell to her jaw. By the 8th, it brushed her shoulders. Fren noticed before Bonnie acknowledged it openly. The healer had a way of observing, without commenting, that Bonnie had come to appreciate deeply. The look she gave, steady and knowing, that said, "I see this," without demanding a conversation about it. Old Soret simply nodded at her one morning, as if the growing hair confirmed something he had already decided. Young Davi, who had no filter and never pretended otherwise, stopped mid-sentence one afternoon and said, "It's getting longer. Can you feel it? It feels like something." "It is something," Bonnie said, and left it there. What she did not say was that she could feel the dead lands differently now. Not through wolf senses. Her wolf was still returning slowly. Still tentative. Like the hair, like the trust, like everything that had been cut and was deciding whether to grow back. But through something older. The same something that had always known when the drums were about to start. That had always known when the dance was needed before any invitation was extended. She felt the dead lands the way she felt a held breath. The ground dry and waiting. The air with a quality of suspension in it. The bone-white trees carrying their stripped branches like a question that had been waiting a very long time for its answer. She was not ready yet. She knew it the way her body always knew, not through decision but through the absence of resistance. And she kept working. The humming had become a practice. She went every evening now, sat outside the lower rooms where the afflicted wolves still turned in their restless half-sleep, and let her hands move their small movements, and her voice find the broken rhythms and give them shape. The wolves inside did not wake cured, but they woke quieter. Something restored to their faces that was not yet recognition, but was no longer the blank, terrible absence either. Something on the way back. Fren had stopped pretending this was ordinary medicine. "My grandmother would have called you a weaver," she said one evening. "Someone whose gift lives in the body. In the movement. We haven't had one in this territory in my lifetime. My people would call it the same thing," Bonnie said. "We just didn't know what it was weaving." Fren was quiet for a moment. "Does it hurt?" "Not having the full length yet." Bonnie considered the honest answer. "It's like trying to sing with half a voice. The song is there, the instrument is still catching up. Then we wait for the instrument." Magnus did not rush her. He did not ask about the dance, did not suggest it, did not build any architecture of expectation around it. He simply continued, with his papers and his practicality and his cup beside them, and he continued to find her. Not intrusively. He appeared in the places she was with the natural consistency of water finding its level, and stayed until she left, and never made it mean more than she was ready for it to mean. There were evenings he told her things. Not declarations, just the slow offering of information that people gave when they were deciding to let someone know them. The dead lands before the rot, when the trees had been green and the river had run loud enough to hear from the castle walls. 11 years of managing a kingdom's slow dying with nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to abandon the wolves who had stayed. He told her these things in the same low, unpracticed voice he used for everything, looking at his cup or the fire. Not at her, the way people sometimes found it easier to be honest when they weren't being directly watched. She listened. She noticed the way his hands stilled completely when she was talking, every other task set aside, his full attention given without performance. The way he laughed, rarely, surprised out of him, not constructed for an audience, changing his whole face in the way she had come to look forward to more than she had admitted to herself. He had not said anything. He was not the kind of man who said things before he was certain they were true, and before he was certain they were wanted. But she knew. What she felt from Magnus in those evenings in the East Hall, the wanting and the patience and the particular quality of a man who had decided that whatever she needed was more important than what he wanted, was as clear and as real as the river had been before the drought took it. He wanted her, not her dancing, not the protection her gift offered his territory. Her, Bonnie, The woman with the herb-stained hands and the growing hair and the laugh she had started recovering somewhere in the 3rd month, low and a little rusty from disuse. She knew, and she was not ready. Not with Gad's claws still recent in her memory. Not with the mate bond cut still tender. Not with the part of her that had loved and trusted completely and been sold still doing the slow, necessary work of learning to trust again. But somewhere in the knowing, without her deciding it, the walls had begun to change. Not fall, but change. The way walls changed when the weather on the other side became less threatening. Still standing, but no longer braced. It was the sound that called her out. Not drums, not music of any kind, just the deadlands at the deep of night. Wind in the skeletal branches, the distant murmur of the settlement, the breathing of old stone as the temperature dropped. She woke at the deepest hour and lay still and felt for the resistance. That quality she had been waiting for, that had been present every time she had considered the dance. The internal not yet that her body had maintained like a guard post. It was gone. She rose without thinking about it. Thinking would have been the wrong approach. She pulled on her outer clothes and her boots and walked out into the cold night air of the castle yard. The yard was empty. The torches burned low. The bone-white trees stood their silent witness, and the ground beneath her boots was cold and hard and dry. The same ground she had felt shift beneath her every day like a tide deciding to change direction. Bonnie stood in the center of the yard and lifted her face to the sky. Her hair fell past her shoulders, still not fully what it had been, still returning, but enough. She felt it against her neck and her back, and felt the deadlands air move through it, and felt the old deep knowledge of the dance settle into her body, like a key into a lock she had almost forgotten she carried. She breathed in. She moved. Her hair moved with her. And the deadlands felt it. She felt the warmth move outward from her in rings, touching the walls of the yard, moving through the stone, through the territory. The bone-white trees at the yard's edge trembled, though there was no wind. The ground shivered, a deep subterranean shiver, anticipatory and alive. She became aware, gradually and then all at once, that she was no longer alone. They had come without being summoned. A door had opened, she would never know whose, and then another, and another. The pack wolves of the deadlands drawn from their beds by something that bypassed thought entirely, and went straight to the place where the body knew things before the mind arrived. They filled the yard's edges, old and young, healers and guards, the woman who hung cloth and the man who mended walls and young Davi still pulling his coat on with one arm. The torches burned steadier than they had any right to in the night air, and above the deadlands the sky was clearing, the flat gray quality thinning, a depth returning, the stars growing sharper as if the atmosphere itself was cleaning. Bonnie felt them arrive and did not stop. She danced for the ground and for the air and for the dry riverbeds that needed to remember what water felt like. She danced for the bone-white trees that were not dead, only waiting, the life stored in the deep root, waiting for the signal that it was safe to return. She danced for the wolves in the lower rooms, fighting their way back from the rot toward language, toward recognition, toward themselves. She danced for herself last, for the girl who had understood what she was too late to protect it from a man too small to deserve it, for the holding pen, and the amber sky, and the cold stone floor and everything she had cried out, and everything she had found on the other side of the crying, for the hair that had been taken and was coming back stronger. She moved into the prism sequence. Her hair lifted as she turned, the dark waves catching and throwing torchlight in fragments of amber and gold, and a green that had no name, scattered across the stone and the faces of the gathered wolves, and the walls of the castle, and the waiting trees. And she felt the border weave, the invisible seam of it, the stitching, her hair a needle moving through something that wasn't visible, and was more real than anything visible. The boundary of the territory being sealed, reinforced, made into something the rot would find impassable, not just sealed, healed. The ground beneath her boots gave one deep shiver and went still, the shiver of something releasing, of something held too long finally letting go. She came to stillness. The yard was absolutely silent. Then the gathered wolves of the Deadlands made a sound that she felt in her sternum. Not applause, not cheering, something more essential than either. The sound of people who had been afraid for so long, they had forgotten what the absence of fear felt like, and were feeling it now, and had no more precise language for it than this. Bonnie stood in the center of the yard and let herself be seen. Fully, completely, without the habit of smallness she had learned in Gad's Hall. She looked across the yard. Magnus was not there. She found him standing at the window of the East Hall with his back to the door, looking out at the yard below where the wolves were still gathered. The 2 cups were on the table. The fire was going. He had not come to the yard, and she understood now that this had been deliberate. That he had watched from above, alone, and had chosen to leave the yard to her, and to his people without inserting himself. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. He turned. His face was open in the way she had seen it only once before, that night in the corridor when he had sat on the floor beside her and said nothing, and stayed. The careful, controlled expression entirely absent. Just his face, and everything on it, and the firelight moving across the scar along his jaw. She crossed to the table and sat. He sat across from her. "You watched from up here," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you come down?" He looked at his cup. "Because it wasn't mine to stand in the middle of. It was yours. Between you and them. I didn't want to be the thing you were aware of when you should have been aware of nothing but the dance." She held that. Found no performance in it. No calculation. Only the plain truth of a man who understood that some moments belonged entirely to someone else. "Why didn't you just ask me to come?" she said. "Without the trade, without all of it." She held his gaze. "You could have sent word." Magnus was quiet for a moment. "Because you were mated," he said, simply. "And I don't take what isn't offered." The words landed and stayed. She looked at him, at the gray eyes holding hers with that total honest presence, nothing managed, nothing withheld, and felt the last door open. Not pushed, not forced, just open, the way doors opened when there was no longer any reason to keep them closed. "And now?" she said. "Eat now," he said. "You're here. And I still won't take what isn't offered." The thing at the corner of his mouth. Not quite the smile, not quite the restraint. "But I'll tell you plainly what I want, if you'll hear it." Her wolf stirred, not tentatively, not carefully, but fully, with a recognition that went below thought and below every wall she had ever built, and arrived at something that had simply always been true. "Tell me," she said. He stood, and then, slowly, deliberately, with both eyes open, he went to one knee. Not desperation. Not the last move of a man with nowhere else to go. Choice, made freely, the deliberate lowering of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. He held the crown out to her. The working crown. Worn dark at the edges, scratched along one side. The crown he wore every day, the one that meant something because it was used rather than displayed. "This kingdom is yours," he said. His voice without the careful management she had always heard underneath it. Just the truth moving through it. "It has been yours since you arrived." The ground knew before I found the words. He paused. "I want you to have everything I have, everything I am, not because of what your gift does for this territory." Another pause, carrying the weight of everything he had not said through all the East Hall evenings, all the cups of spiced drink, all the hours of chosen silence. "Because of what you do to me, Bonnie. Every quiet evening, every time you laughed and looked surprised that you had. Every morning I knew you were somewhere in this castle, and the knowing was enough to make the day different from every day before you came." His jaw tightened, not against the feeling, but with it. "You didn't come here to be loved. I know that. But I have loved you anyway, from before you arrived and every day since, and I would rather kneel here and say it plainly than stand over there and pretend I don't." The East Hall was absolutely silent. Bonnie felt the last wall go. Not broken, not fallen, released. The way the ground had released under the dance, the way frost left when warmth had finally been given permission to stay. Her eyes burned. She did not look away from him. She reached out and took the crown from his hands. She looked at it for a long moment. The weight of it. The worn reality of it. 11 years of a man refusing to abandon his wolves, refusing to leave the dead ground. She felt all of that in the metal. Then she set it gently back on his head. "Stand up," she said. "I don't want your crown." He looked up at her. "I want you," she said. "Beside me. Not above me and not below me. Beside." She held his gaze with everything she had. The carriage and the corridor, and the cold stone floor, and the growing hair and every quiet evening they had built, without announcing they were building anything. "As my mate, Magnus, if you'll have me." He stood. And the distance between them that had always been careful, always been considered, was simply gone. He raised his hand and touched her face. She leaned into it without the thinking part's permission, shanty because some things were finished being decided and had simply become true. He kissed her. Not tentative, not the careful beginning of something unsure of its welcome. He kissed her the way the Deadlands had received the dance. Fully, after a long wait, with the depth of something that had been patient long enough and was finished with patience. She kissed him back. When they parted, she kept her eyes closed for one breath. Not from shyness, but from the desire to hold the feeling precisely as it was. The warmth of him. The realness of him. She opened her eyes. "The river?" she said softly. From the eastern edge of the territory, faint but unmistakable, the sound of water moving. Something moved through his face. The slight widening of the gray eyes, and the quality of a man encountering wonder after a long education in its absence. "The river," he said. "It's coming back," she said. He looked at her. So is everything. Gad arrived at the Deadlands with 12 men, and the full weight of a man who had convinced himself, on the long, desperate ride, that he still had something to bargain with. He came with a sealed offer and the posture of someone who had rehearsed too many times. The words gone smooth and unconvincing. The way stones went smooth from too much handling. He had built an architecture of justification so complete he could almost live inside it without noticing the walls were made of lies. He had made a mistake. He would correct the mistake. He would name a number generous enough that even a rogue king would find it difficult to refuse. He told himself this with the determination of a man who already knew he was lying. The border guards received him without warmth and without hostility. When the escort finally came, it led him to the Great Hall, and he was not prepared for what he found there. Not the hall itself. What he had not expected was Bonnie. She was standing at Magnus's right side, not arranged there, not positioned for effect, but standing the way people stood in places they belonged, with the natural ease of someone who had found their correct location in the world. Her hair fell past her waist, longer than it had ever been in Ashvale, richer, moving in the still air of the hall with a quality that made the light behave differently around her. Magnus stood beside her, not above her, not in front of her. Beside. Gad looked at her and felt the sealed offer in his coat become suddenly and completely ridiculous. He set it on the table anyway. Old habits. "I've come for Bonnie," he said. "I'm prepared to offer fair and generous compensation, whatever figure the king names." "How much?" Bonnie said. "Do you think a queen with her gift is worth?" The question fell into the hall like a stone into still water. Gad heard the word queen. His eyes moved to Magnus, who looked back at him with the flat gray attention of a man who had no interest in the conversation and every intention of letting it conclude however it concluded. Then back to Bonnie. Her hair, the way she stood, the hall around her that smelled different, cleaner, the air carrying something returning to it, and the architecture he had built on the long ride here developed, and very quietly, a crack. He looked at the sealed offer on the table. There was no number in it. He understood that now. He thought of the count his second had delivered that morning. 41 wolves in the rot. The blacksmith's boy, 9 years old, still lost behind his own eyes in the healer's room. The river genuinely gone, the bed of it cracked and pale as old bone. 3 harvests. The elder woman who had danced beside Bonnie at harvest festivals, gone mad in her own kitchen last Tuesday. He thought of the holding pen, the amber sky, the sound of her hair hitting the stone floor. He had sold the only thing keeping his pack alive and called it authority. The crack became something that could no longer be called a crack. Gad's knees found the floor. Not performance. The real kind. Both knees on the stone. In the alpha chain swinging forward, 12 men behind him going absolutely still. He did not ask for forgiveness. He had ridden here with the intention of buying her back, and found a queen in a living kingdom. And he understood, kneeling on the cold floor of it, that there was nothing in him worth forgiving yet. He raised his eyes to her. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he said. "I don't have the right to ask you for anything." He paused. "The consequences of what I did, I'll face them alone. But my pack didn't choose this. The children didn't choose this. They are suffering for what I did, and they don't deserve it." His voice held barely. "I'm asking for them. Not for myself. Let my pack come to the Deadlands. Let them have what I threw away. Just let them be well." The hall was silent. Bonnie looked at him for a long time. All of what he had been, and all of what he had done, and all of what he was now, kneeling on someone else's floor. The grief of 6 years. The anger that would take years more to move through. And underneath both, separate from both, the simple fact of 41 wolves who had done nothing wrong and a 9-year-old boy who deserved to find his way back to himself. "Your pack may come," she said. "Every wolf in the rot, every child, anyone who needs the healing. They are welcome in the Deadlands. Bring them." He breathed, the exhale of a man whose last hope had been answered. He stood. He looked at her one final time, found truthfully that he had nothing left to offer that was worth offering, and walked out. The door closed behind him. He returned 6 days later with his entire pack. They came in a long, slow procession. Wolves on foot and on horseback, carts carrying those too deep in the rot to walk. Children holding the hands of parents whose eyes were too frightened to be comforted by anything yet. 300 wolves in total. 43 in the rot, 7 of them children. The Deadlands received them. Bonnie moved through the arriving wolves with a steadiness that asked nothing of them. No performance of gratitude, no accounting. Just, "You are here. You are safe. Let us begin." She found the children first, the way she always found children first, and crouched to their level and spoke the way her mother had always spoken to frightened things. Directly, with the warmth of someone who was not pretending the fear wasn't real, but was also not pretending it was permanent. In the days that followed, the rot began releasing its grip on the Aldenmore wolves, the same way it had released its grip on the Deadlands wolves. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, the direction reversing. The blacksmith's boy was the first to say a word. One word, his mother's name, hoarse and uncertain, as if testing whether language still worked. And his mother, sitting beside him as she had sat for 2 weeks without leaving, put her face in her hands and shook. On the morning of the 9th day, Gad found her in the yard. He stopped at a respectful distance. He had been doing that, she had noticed. Keeping distance, taking up as little space as possible, helping where help was needed without asking for recognition. "My pack is stable," he said. "The rot is receding. The children are coming back." He paused. "I came to thank you. And Magnus." He reached into his coat. What he withdrew was a small thing. The alpha sigil of Aldenmore, worn smooth at the edges from years of daily handling. He looked at it the way you looked at something you were genuinely putting down. Not performing the putting down, but actually doing it. Then he bent and set it on the ground between them. He straightened. He looked at her once. Fully. The grief still there and the shame still there, both of them permanent residents now. "Thank you," he said, simply. He turned and walked toward the border. Bonnie watched the way he walked, not the alpha posture, not the chest-out deliberate authority she had known for 6 years. Just a man walking. Just a man who had set something down that had taken him years to pick up, and longer to be willing to release. Gad. He stopped, turned. She looked at him across the yard in the Deadlands morning with his sigil on the ground between them. "You don't have to leave," she said. "There is a place here if you want it. Not as alpha. Not as anything you were." She held his gaze. "As a common wolf. You work for your place the same way every wolf here works for theirs. No title, no history borrowed from Aldenmore. You earn it, day by day." She paused. "That is the only path to my forgiveness that exists. It is a long one. I won't pretend otherwise. But it's there." He looked at her for a long time. She did not soften it, and she did not harden it. She let it be exactly what it was. An offer, not a gift. A door, not an open embrace. He looked at the sigil on the ground. He did not pick it up. He dipped his head, not the alpha bow, just a man receiving something he hadn't earned with the only honesty he had left, and said, "Tell me where to start." Spring came to the Deadlands for the first time in 11 years. It came as if it had been waiting, accumulating just past the border, patient, invited back all at once. The bone-white trees leafed green in a single week. Every one of them, all across the territory. The river ran full and loud enough to hear from the castle walls. The feral rot released its remaining hold on the last of the afflicted wolves, and each day carried one more person back to themselves. Gad worked. Without announcement, without the visible suffering of a man performing penance, he repaired walls, helped with the harvest preparation, sat with the Aldenmore wolves still finding their way back, and talked them through recovery with a steadiness that surprised her when she observed it. He was learning something. Slowly, expensively, in the only way real learning ever came. She did not offer forgiveness yet, but she stopped holding the distance quite as deliberately. That was enough, for now. On the first true evening of spring, when the air had the quality of warmth that was not yet summer but had stopped pretending to be winter, Bonnie stood in the castle yard as the sun went low and felt the full living weight of what the Deadlands had become. The river was audible from here, running clear and insistent through the territory's eastern edge. The trees along the yard's border moved in the evening air, properly green, the new leaves catching the last of the light and turning it gold. The settlement beyond the walls was making the sounds of a place at rest, not the exhausted silence of a place enduring, but the easy murmur of a place that had eaten well and was warm and was not afraid. Her hair moved around her in the evening air. It fell past her waist now, longer than it had ever been. The growth of the Deadlands woven into it alongside the growth of everything else here, richer and darker, carrying a quality of movement even when she was still. She felt it the way she always felt it, as extension, as instrument, as the living part of the gift that never fully rested. She felt Magnus before she heard him. Her wolf lifting, easy and certain, had the mate bond between them a thing of daily warmth now rather than careful distance. He came to stand beside her. She leaned into him, the side of her shoulder against his arm, her head tipping slightly. He settled under it the way he settled under everything, fully, without wasted motion, without making it more complicated than it was. They stood together and looked at the living territory around them. "Gad repaired the north wall today," he said. "I know. Friend told me." "She tells you everything." "She tells me the things she thinks I should know," Bonnie said. "It's different." He made a low sound that was almost a laugh. She felt it through the arm she was leaning against. The evening deepened. The first stars came out over the Deadlands, properly visible now, the sky with depth and dimension. A sky that looked like it belonged above a living place. "I've been thinking," Magnus said. "About what?" About the fact that I have never once watched you dance without it undoing something in me that I didn't know needed undoing. She smiled, fully, reaching everywhere. That's a very careful way to say something. I'm a careful man. You are, she said, except when you're not. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. The evening light was doing what evening light did to the scar along his jaw, softening the edge of it, making it look like exactly what it was, a part of a face that had lived through things and was still standing. She had come to love that scar the way she had come to love all the worn and honest things about him. The scratched crown, the thumb marks in old books, and the 2 cups on the table that had never been explained and had never needed to be. I am grateful, she said quietly, that you don't take what isn't offered. His expression did the thing she had spent months learning. The slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the gray eyes warming. And I am grateful, he said, that you offered. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against the scar along his jaw, the way he had first touched her face, fully, with attention, without asking her to hold anything lightly that she wanted to hold with weight. He turned into it, the smallest movement, and covered her hand with his. She thought of the carriage, the amber sky, the holding pen and the iron door and the decision she had made in the darkness to walk out on her own feet. She thought of the cold stone floor of the corridor and everything she had cried out, and everything she had found on the other side. The East Hall evenings and the 2 cups and the fire and the slow, unannounced, extraordinarily patient building of something she had not known she was allowed to have again. She kissed him. Not the first kiss. That had been the yard, the crown, the declaration. This was the other kind. The quieter kind. The kind that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. That lived in the daily accumulated evidence of 2 people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other, and intended to keep doing so. He kissed her back. His hand moved through her hair with the ease of someone touching something that was also touching them back. The gift stirring warmly in response, as if the hair itself had made its own decision about this man, long before the rest of her had caught up. When they parted, the evening was full dark, and the stars were bright, and the river was running, and the Deadlands breathed its clean, unheld breath all around them, and the border was woven tight and strong with everything she carried, and the territory, this impossible, forsaken, patient, surviving territory, was alive. She pressed her face briefly against his jaw, felt the warmth of him, the steadiness of him, the particular quality of being beside someone who had waited for her without making the waiting into a debt. And they stood together in the living dark of the Deadlands, his arm around her, and her hair moving in the spring air, and the kingdom breathing easily around them, until the stars were fully out, and the night was warm, and there was no longer any reason to go inside and every reason to stay exactly where they were. Together. Always, now, together. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If Bonnie's journey back to herself left a mark, if Magnus made you believe again in the kind of love that waits without taking, subscribe to this channel and leave a thoughtful comment below. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one.